Hello, I'm Stuart Leach. I'm Head of Litigation and Disputes at Montfort Communications. And welcome to this discussion on the increasingly important subject of whistleblowers. We're going to be taking a look at this from both sides of the Atlantic to get a US-UK perspective. And I'm joined by an outstanding panel of people who know considerably more than most others about this particular topic. I've got two partners from Constantine Cannon, Mary Inman and Henry Sue. Mary's a partner in the Constantine Cannon London office, and after 20 plus years representing whistleblowers in the US, she brought her skills over to London to do it there. And she's representing whistleblowers in the UK, the EU, and worldwide under the American Whistleblower Program. Henry's a partner at Constantine Cannon in Washington, DC. He has a trial and appellate practice that specializes in disputes involving antitrust, intellectual property, and technology, and leverages over 20 years of accumulated courtroom experiences on a wide range of cases. We're also joined by two journalists. We have Katherine Eban, a New York-based investigative journalist. She's a Vanity Fair contributor and an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her articles on pharmaceutical counterfeiting, coercive interrogations by the CIA, and her recent expose of the chloroquine situation with the Trump government put her as a leading light in revealing what's going on behind the scenes. Martin Bright is a British journalist, and he worked for the BBC World Service, The Guardian, and then worked at The Observer, where he investigated the whistleblowing of Katherine Gun, who was concerning a request by the United States for compromising intelligence on diplomats from member states of the Security Council when they were voting on the UN resolution on the prospective 2003 invasion of Iraq. He's actually been in a film, not himself. He was played by Matt Smith in Official Secrets, if you want to go and see it. Anyway, those are that's the panel, and I think you'll agree it's a fantastic lineup. Mary, I'm going to start with you, really. Having worked both in the US and the UK, what differences do you see in the treatment of and attitudes towards whistleblowers in the UK compared to the US?
It's interesting that the attitudes in some ways are very similar, in some ways very different. So one of the things that I think is the same is there is a recognition, and I think that we're in the midst of a bit of a cultural shift towards a greater appreciation for whistleblowers. I think we still have a long way to go, but compared to where we were, it was some of the treatment of whistleblowers continues to be, as I think most people here can appreciate, pretty horrific in terms of past experiences with whistleblowers, that a whistleblower, rather than being embraced for bringing information to light that could help and assist the public, is often, much to their surprise, treated like a skunk at the picnic. So I think while we all are, I think, amidst a cultural shift in the United States, we have, I think, more well-trodden paths for whistleblowers and programs that embrace whistleblowers and allow them to be empowered and bring their information to be activated by the US government enforcement agencies. That is not the case in the United Kingdom, where I think a lot of whistleblowers remain frustrated upon making disclosures to the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and being very disappointed by lack of a response. So I think there tends to be, I think, just to sum it up, we are able in the United States to activate and allow whistleblowers to actually bring their information forward and not just be protected against retaliation, but looking forward, have their information be utilized to actually right the wrong that they signaled the alarm about in the first place.
So, Katherine, I mean, does that make life easier for a US journalist, do you think?
As easier for journalists, but I do think that life is a little easier for whistleblowers in the sense that there are very clear legal protections for whistleblowers that have bipartisan support. That said, you know, we're in an extraordinary moment where there have been, you know, consistent attacks on the press, and consistent attacks on whistleblowers. So the most recent example that we've seen in the US is Rick Bright, Dr. Rick Bright, who headed a very big vaccine agency called BARDA. And basically, he stepped forward to say that the government was muzzling scientists, was putting politics ahead of science, which seems clear, and was, pushing forward this unproven treatment of hydroxychloroquine against the recommendations of top doctors and scientists within the administration. So, he spoke up to blow the whistle and paid for it with his job. So that is really he has been the most high profile whistleblower of the coronavirus outbreak here in the US.
And Martin, it was a bit when you were handling the Katherine gun matter. I mean, how difficult was that within the UK at the time you were doing it?
Well, it's quite a long time ago now. It seems like ancient history now, in a sense, the Iraq War. But in a way, Katherine Gunn was an unusual whistleblower in that she didn't go directly to the press. She simply disclosed and hoped that something would come of her disclosure. So the difficulties for us were really not in managing her as a whistleblower, because she didn't come to us directly, but in verifying her information. I think we've learned a lot since then, and particularly in the realms of intelligence service whistleblowers. Cases, including Edward Snowden's case, have meant that we've become a lot wiser to the activities of the intelligence services. But I would say that the British example is still, the British example of whistleblowing is still a very troubled one. We like the idea of whistleblowers, but we don't really like the reality. There still remains, I think, an instinct towards secrecy within British culture that perhaps is creeping into the way that things are going in the United States, but is not built into your kind of constitutional makeup. Whereas in the UK, there's always been an assumption of secrecy first on the part of government, and lawyers and journalists and activists have to prove why government should disclose. Whereas we've always looked to the States as being a great example of things being the other way around, although I fear things are changing.
Well, Henry, I mean, with COVID-19 and all the money that's swilling around, there's going to be a lot of fraud going on. I mean, we're seeing it emerge already. How important is it that whistleblowers take on the role of first responder, do you think?
So Stuart, yeah, I mean, I think COVID-19 is really, for me, it's unusual because it's not just the money. It's not just the emergency funds that are going to businesses and to employees who are adversely affected by the pandemic, but then there's also the public health issue. And so I think, as Katherine mentioned, Dr. Bright, for instance, is a great example of where we've got people who are motivated to speak up, not just because there could be funds that are misused or wasted, or subject to fraud, but you've got people who could potentially be hurt. I mean, that was Dr. Bright's concern, was that hydroxychloroquine is a drug that's not been, proven to be effective against the coronavirus. And at the same time, it's got these harmful side effects like irregular heartbeat and that sort of thing. So I think it's motivating people to speak out, not just because dollars could be wasted, but also because people could die.
I mean, Mary, coming from the US to the UK as you have done, and listening to some of the differences in terms of development of that, and to Martin's point regarding, the default to secrecy, how important is it that the culture is changed or developed so that people feel comfortable to come forward, particularly now where there is so much going on in terms of the amount of money that's sloshing around in all sorts of different places, as Henry said?
And I think it's vital. In the United States, we've felt like, certainly with the Ukraine whistleblower, that whistleblowers in a way have become the fourth branch of government. So I think it's vital. They are watchdogs and always have been watchdogs. But I think now, in a time of crisis where governments, including the UK government, the American government, governments across the globe, have been less than forthcoming with the information about how they are handling the virus, and to some extent giving conflicting public health information, it is really important that whistleblowers speak out now more than ever and feel comfortable to do so. Interestingly, of course, it also dovetails with the other crisis, which is going on in the U.S., but I think has spawned a racial reawakening into racial justice issues, is Black Lives Matter movement. And in fact, there have been a number of whistleblowers within police departments who play that vital role as well. So I think you put your finger on it, Stuart, that the key is to making whistleblowers feel comfortable that they can speak out. And the recipe for that, at least in the United Kingdom, has been to have robust legislation to protect whistleblowers after the fact from retaliation. The United Kingdom has the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which was ahead of its time 20 years ago. But what whistleblowers want is not just protection, but they want to know that the information they're bringing forward will be acted upon. And I think that's where we are not in the United Kingdom providing that level of assurance that it will not be a futile act to sound the alarm, because there can be nothing worse than sounding the alarm only to expose yourself, have yourself be a casualty along the side of the road, and then have what you were trying to expose swept under the rug.
And that's why it's really important that there's a sort of working relationship between the media and the lawyers on this, isn't it? Because I think, Katherine and Martin, you can advise us on this, but I think that, being able to put something out is potentially the best protection that someone has, isn't it? Martin?
Yes, it is. And clearly there's still a kind of romantic association in the general culture about the relationship between whistleblowers and whistleblowers and newspapers, not least because of the various Hollywood portrayals of that relationship. But I think we need to put a health warning on this, because our traditional media is under fire. Its traditional financial models are crumbling, particularly in the UK. We've just seen this week, the Guardian newspaper group in the UK, which obviously has a presence in the States as well, announcing over 100 redundancies. We are seeing the stripping back of the investigative capacities of newspapers, and it's unlike anything we've ever seen before. And this is a huge challenge to the democratic process. It's no coincidence that figures such as Donald Trump are going on the attack against the media because he's a bully and he knows that they're weak.
Yeah. And how are you finding that in the US, Katherine? I mean, obviously you've been getting your investigations published recently, but how do you see it developing in terms of needing to give air and publicity to the whistleblowers, but the fact that there may be things coming in the way that prevent that?
Well, I'll give you a story of two contrasting experience of whistleblowers. So one is the whistleblower that I featured in my book, Bottle of Lies, Dinesh Thakur, who blew the whistle on Ranbaxy and their fraudulent data practices. And Ranbaxy was India's largest drug company. But when he tried to alert the world's regulators, the only regulator who responded to him was the US FDA. What ended up happening, which I chronicle in the book, is an 8-year investigation, at the end of which Ranbaxy pled guilty to 7 felonies, and the government made a huge financial recovery, and Dinesh Thakur, who was incredibly courageous, risked his life to do this, wound up with $48 million. So even though he suffered intensely and it sort of tore apart his life, that was a story that had, to some extent, a happy ending in that he was compensated under U.S. key tam laws, and he and Ranbaxy was doesn't exist anymore. So that was positive. But then if you look at the Ukraine, some of the folks involved in the Ukraine investigation, look at Lieutenant Colonel Inman, incredibly courageous, who initially flagged Trump's conversations on Ukraine to the Inspector General. He testified famously that, as he reassured his father, here in the US, right matters. And yet in the last, I think, couple of weeks, he finally ended up retiring from the military because his promotion was blocked and he was essentially drummed out of the military. And, he served his country with incredible courage. And that's where it wound up.
So Henry, listening to that, I mean, do you think that there should be greater legislation, or is there sufficient protection, formal protection for whistleblowers, or should more be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think more can always be done. For instance, with the coronavirus, there are a couple of bills pending in both the House and the Senate that aim to give whistleblower protection, to people who have knowledge of fraud, waste, and mismanagement, abuse in connection with coronavirus relief. So I think more can always be done. I mean, I think that the sad part of the story, obviously, is that the bills have been proposed by the Democrats in both houses of Congress, and query whether the Republicans will go along with it. I mean, I think historically there's been bipartisan support for whistleblower protection, but I mean, this issue involving the pandemic is so politically charged that I don't know where it's going to end up. Maybe Mary has a different view of that.
Well, Mary, I mean, I'm guessing that the legislative protection for whistleblowers in the UK is worse than in the US. Or is it? I mean, we don't have the bounty system in the UK. So how would you assess it? And what more should be done?
So in the United Kingdom, I would say that the American system to protections, and let's limit protections to employment protections, retaliation, just on that score, the UK is still ahead of the United States, because our retaliation employment law protections are very fragmented. So we've been very reactive in response to the Enron scandal. We did Sarbanes-Oxley and we put in protections there. In response to the financial crisis with Dodd-Frank, we have whistleblower protections there. But we don't have a global overarching protection, which the United Kingdom does in the form of the Public Interest Disclosure Act. That said, you were leaders. The United Kingdom was leader in this space 20 years ago when they adopted it. You've since been outpaced by Ireland, the UK whistleblower directive, which have gone much farther in expanding the definition of who is a whistleblower to include, most importantly, friends like Katherine and Martin below, to recognize that it's journalists. There's a downward knock-on effect from whistleblowers, that they often have those negative consequences also reverberate to their families and to the journalists who assist them. So we've made some real progress in the UK directive. But the query whether the United Kingdom actually has to follow that, there's a very divergent views whether they're grandfathered in or not, and we'll see. That remains to be seen, but I don't think that the UK will follow the directive.
Yeah, I mean, Katherine mentioned the financial aspect of it, and how important is the bounty, and should that be brought into the UK?
So that's what I've been spending the past 3 years talking about, and I'm very proud to say that in the first 2 years of my being here, to a person in the United Kingdom, when I talked about being with an American accent, talking about whistleblower reward programs, there's sort of this shock and horror that we're British. We don't need to pay our people rewards. We do it because it's the right thing to do, you mercenary Americans who are—
That includes me, by the way.
Exactly. And then I'm
very mercenary, actually. I'm on that side. It's okay.
And the more you recharacterize this, including just last week at the University of York, I used the barometer for the British, the thermometer barometer on the British sentiment towards rewards on Baroness Kramer, who's been in our all-party parliamentary group for whistleblowers. She has made a complete 360. And it all depends on the language. When you reframe and get rid of the terminology like bounty and think about a reward more like unemployment insurance, then it becomes very attractive in the UK sort of cultural pantheon. So what Baroness Kramer has said is that we don't look askance if someone loses their hand working on a production line. We will pay career-long unemployment insurance. But why is that any different than what a whistleblower suffers? It's blacklisting, career blacklisting. So Dinesh Thakur's was making, I don't know what I forget at what point he blew the whistle, but recognize, 48 million is a lot of money. But if you start amortizing that across a career, he was presumably making six figures. All of a sudden, that $48 million doesn't seem quite as gobsmacking of a number. It's still quite big, but isn't that the signal we want to send to whistleblowers to change that cultural perception that you're worthy of this? And it's still what we need to think about is the money that Dinesh Thakur was helping the American government recover, and the people who were not sold toxic drugs. That was close to a $500 million settlement.
Yeah, I mean, Katherine, when you've been sorry,
no, go ahead.
I was going to say when you've been dealing with whistleblowers. They're all presumably working on the basis that they're not going to work again.
Dinesh Thakur is a very interesting case study, really, because he actually had no idea that there were A, any legal protections for him, or B, any compensation for him. He was completely motivated by his overriding fear of Ranbaxy's drugs, was so significant that he put aside his own risk to his life, which was significant operating as a whistleblower in India. And, he was sort of stunned partway through this journey to learn that he could get a lawyer who wouldn't charge him, and then that he was potentially able to recoup a percentage of the government's, proceeds from the case. So that all came as news to him.
Oh, so I mean, he wasn't motivated by it at all. I mean, that's fits in with the idea of kind of like unemployment insurance. You've got to do it for the right reason, I guess. But I think the money is a critical part of it, because people have to be. It's that encouraging people to be the first responder, isn't it? Because as I believe, Mary, that it's not. When people whistleblow, they've already tried to raise this several times before. Is that correct?
That's right. The statistics we have coming out of the SEC program, and the SEC's whistleblower program has been around since 2011. And the data is showing that in 85% of the cases, the whistleblowers who brought tips to the SEC first tried not one, not two, but at least 3 or 4 times to report internally. So it's consistent with Katherine's recollection of what's going on with Dinesh. Very similar. Our whistleblowers don't even often know that they're whistleblowers. They only know they're a whistleblower until they're treated like one. So I think of the rewards more as sort of something to offset the risks, sort of more as an enticement to serve as a tipping point for someone who's sitting on the fence, who's saying, do I risk my family's livelihood, my health for the public good? Is this, and I'm having that conversation with my spouse saying, I'm about to undertake this crazy action. Is there something that's a safety net that could, in the form of this potential reward, that could be as a tipping point to get you off that fence into deciding to alert the public?
And on the basis that, a lot of whistleblowers, they're doing this because we want to see a change. They want to see something done differently or corrected and learn for the future. How important do you think, Henry, civil litigation is on the back of what whistleblowers reveal? Is that another level which people should be encouraged to follow, or is it not helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, some agencies in the U.S. have bounty programs, but there frequently are going to be cases where, there's no the whistleblower simply reveals what he or she knows, and there's not really any kind of compensation to him or her, or even to the public without some recourse towards private civil litigation. So I think that the fact that we have follow-on litigation can help validate the whistleblower's decision to make his or her concerns public, to show that there is this harm, and that is redressable by the courts.
Yeah. I mean, as a group, do you feel that people are becoming more confident in blowing the whistle on things? Martin, do you find that?
I think it very much depends on the area that you're talking about. So I do believe that in the area of fraud, that companies are becoming wiser, and I mean, there's a huge generalization, but I believe there has been a process of education, not least because of the actions of lawyers like Mary, that people are changing, attitudes are changing, corporate attitudes are changing in some areas. And I think there's an understanding that there needs to be a more systematized approach to whistleblowing, a normalization of whistleblowing, and that whistleblowing is good for you. Whistleblowing is good for companies. I think when you move into the area of intelligence, which is where a lot of my work's focused, I think things are getting worse. One of the things that's extremely worrying in the UK is that new official secrets legislation is coming down the tracks, and there is still no public interest defense to blowing the whistle on extreme wrongdoing in the intelligence services in the UK. And I suspect that what seems to be happening in terms of secrecy and official secrecy, government secrecy, is unfortunately the United States is learning from the UK. So whereas it seems to be healthy and going in the right direction, that we're learning from the US in terms of incentives and in terms of the belief that the exposing of corporate fraud is a public good. I fear that in terms of government wrongdoing, intelligence wrongdoing, things are looking quite dark.
So Katherine, does that mean that having probably had a steady stream of people knocking on your door, the knocks are getting a bit rarer?
First of all, let me say, Martin's just said something hopeful. The idea that we're learning from the UK instead of from like Azerbaijan is positive. But I do think that there is a sense here among whistleblowers that there is such profound intransigence inside the Trump administration, and such sort of a sense that nothing really matters anymore. The Trump administration has been protected by Senate Republicans here. It's had a chilling effect. So, anybody watching the impeachment proceedings and thinking about blowing the whistle, I think it was an incredibly discouraging sight to see. There's not a lot of, positivity that came out of it for somebody thinking about standing up and raising their hand and doing the right thing.
Well, I mean, so on balance, sorry, Mary.
Sure, can I pick up on Katherine's point, which is that I think it's so interesting that the Ukraine whistleblower to me is such an interesting litmus test, because in that case, and now we have legislation that the Democrats have put forward saying, making it criminally a criminal penalty, penalizing you for revealing the identity of a whistleblower, because that's exactly what happened, and it was astonishing, odious behavior, particularly in a case where it was irrelevant who that whistleblower was, because the whistleblower had been fully corroborated by 9 separate witnesses. Yet the administration persisted in finding out who he was and actually revealing his name, which should be criminal conduct. So I think I share Martin's view that we have a long way to go with intelligence whistleblowers, and that was an astonishing example of why you wouldn't want to be one, because your name would be dragged across and your family's life is put at risk. So
yeah. So what would be your dream bit of legislation to help with this?
Me, I can say what
everybody.
I would say that we have an opportunity, in fact, in the UK to lead the world on this, which is that the present government has pledged to reform the Official Secrets Act in order to make it easier for the British government to act on state operatives, i.e. Russians and Chinese mainly, acting in the UK. And in return, there needs to be a campaign to introduce a very strictly regulated public interest defence for whistleblowers in the intelligence services. And if we get that right, I think other countries can learn from that. So that would be my change in the legislation in this country.
Yeah, but Katherine,
yeah. One of the things that I would like to see, which has really had profound effects in the last few years, is protection of inspectors general, who are the watchdogs inside these government agencies and really the first recourse for any government whistleblower. But essentially, those people are just getting taken out. So we're losing the mechanisms of accountability. And for example, in the case of Rick Bright, who has now asked for reinstatement to his job, but the watchdogs who would force that reinstatement are being essentially summarily executed, in a bureaucratic sense by the Trump administration. So all of those watchdog mechanisms need protection.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to become a core part of any organization, doesn't it? And take a corporate point of view, that what Martin said, you need almost a director of whistleblowing in order to be someone that people feel comfortable to come to, and it's ingrained within the DNA of any organization. That's what we should be heading for. Would you share that view, Henry? Or?
I do. I mean, just going back to the legislation that's currently proposed for COVID-19, the protected parties are government contractors and private sector employees. There's no provision made for government employees. I think that's where the U.S. Still falls short. Is what do you do about people like Dr. Bright? That depend on the Office of Special Counsel to do this investigation to see if there's likelihood of wrongdoing with their dismissal or the shift in positions. So we just have a different standard for government whistleblowers compared to people in the private sector.
Can I add to Henry's point, which is that we in our whistleblower practice group have started to advocate for the payment of whistleblower rewards to government whistleblowers, because as Henry pointed out, in the U.S. I think it's quite convenient that the United States embraces whistleblowers when they're helping them point out corporate fraud, that they've been defrauded, they're the victim. But when it's the government that the finger is being pointed at as the wrongdoer, then we do not think rewards should be paid, or we haven't moved to that. So I would very much like to see legislation in the United States having rewards go not only to the corporate insiders, but also to the government employees.
And you'd like to see that in the UK as well, I'm guessing?
Well, yes. I mean, in the UK, Stuart, we've got some really interesting legislation, to your point about there being a central clearinghouse. The All-Party Parliamentary Group for Whistleblowing has a bill circulating, a private member's bill, asking for an office of the whistleblower as that central clearinghouse. So I think that is great, is because so much of it is about the signposting. A whistleblower in the throes of the existential crisis that is to blow or not to blow, you have to figure out in this current context in the UK, who do you even go to? Who can you make a protected disclosure to? If we have it signposted that there's an office of professionals who are there to help you and receive it and process your claim, I think that's a great first step. The cynical part of me says, but who within that agency is going to tell the FCA when they haven't acted on a particular tip that they actually have to do something. That's
Yeah.
that's the fear I have, but I think it's a really good start, and I think the UK is making progress and is certainly looking to update its legislation.
Well, I mean, how do you see the, I mean, everyone's talking about the potential for whistleblowing activity arising from COVID. How do you see that shaping the future of whistleblowing legislation and, I suppose, assistance? Mary, I'm going to go for you on this one.
I think it's got to help us for the better. I would think in both in the UK and the US, because we've seen whistleblowers come forward and I mean, whenever there's that much money that is being earmarked for COVID relief, then you need ample watchdogs. And I think the whistleblowers have spoken up, and certainly within the NHS and other places, against private contractors as well, to expose the mishandling of the situation, as well as the misappropriation of the funds. So I would hope that this would serve as just added proof of the value of whistleblowers, because certainly in the UK, but also in the US, they've been the first people to point out the fact that in the US PPP, Paycheck Protection Program funds are going to small businesses who in turn are then just spending it on their own cryptocurrency and vanity projects. So one would hope that that would help raise our profile.
Yeah, I mean, and we've touched on the sort of the difficulties that are occurring in the US but you know, your piece on hydrochloroquine, Katherine, I mean, did that unblock something around COVID-19 whistleblowing, or what's been the impact of it?
Well, you know, the impact of my reporting, maybe cumulatively, is that the FDA finally backed up and withdrew its emergency use authorization. You know, evidence mounted that hydroxychloroquine was unsafe, and Rick Bright was proved correct in his observations, but not before he paid a terrible price, you know, which is that he was forced out of his job as you know, the US's #1 vaccine developer in the middle of a pandemic. Really striking.
So do you think that's put people off, or is it encouraging others? What's your
You
feeling?
know, I'm not sure that this is just, I'm not sure that taken all together, Rick Bright's journey in all of this, and the you know, the kind of retaliatory nature of the Trump administration, I think it's had a chilling effect. You know, I think people are terrified of being kind of outed by people in the Trump administration, of having, you know, online gangs, you know, terrorizing their families and getting doxxed online. And I think all of this really has a very chilling effect.
Yeah. Okay.
Stuart,
Well, sorry.
A positive note to that too. I totally agree with Katherine, but I think there is a ray of hope in terms of, and Katherine and I both know about this individual, we're starting to see the expansion of whistleblowers beyond the traditional realm of insiders to what we start to call a breed of whistleblowers that are outsiders looking in. And in terms of the COVID pandemic, there was a woman, is a microbiologist by the name of Elizabeth Bick, who has been featured as sort of the scientist sleuth. And what she has been doing is looking at published research and looking for misstatements and basically research fraud. And in the course of doing that, she exposed the very study on hydroxychloroquine that a French scientist that President Trump was relying upon. So I think it's just interesting that there still are those people who she had that information. It's equally valuable. She didn't acquire it by being on the inside, but she acquired it in a different way and brought it to light. So I do think that, although I share the sentiment that we have fewer and fewer investigative journalists and that we're starting to see people react to that void and become scientist sleuths themselves. That gives me a little bit of hope.
So this was going to bring me to my final ask of you all, which is, you know, the world for the whistleblower, is it better than it's ever been or worse than it's ever been? And is it moving in the right direction? Henry?
Like Mary, I have some hope that it's moving in the right direction. I mean, I think how I come at this is, you know, I think, you know, Dinesh's example, you know, there's research, social science research that validates that people will become whistleblowers out of a sense of moral duty. But even so, though, right, they face a great deal of uncertainty in terms of the law, in terms of whether what they think is a problem is really a problem that's recognized by the law. So they really depend on both lawyers and journalists to help validate their story. They also face uncertainty, obviously, in terms of what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to their jobs, you know, livelihood and all that. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think anything we can do to, you know, bring greater certainty to the path that a whistleblower takes is hopeful.
So Martin, healthy, unhealthy, going in the right direction?
I think things have always been very, very difficult for whistleblowers, and will continue to be so. I mean, that's the natural state of the whistleblower. We've always seen them as complicated figures, either as snitches, traitors, difficult people, or on the other hand, kind of superheroes. So these are. It's always been difficult to be a whistleblower, and the hope always lies in the fact that despite that, people do come forward. Now, I think where the optimism and the hope lies is that I think people like us, so journalists, lawyers, people of good faith, are beginning to realize just how important to the lifeblood of our political culture, our corporate culture, these individuals are. And it's incumbent upon us to use new technology, use the law, use campaigning to make it easier for them to come forward.
Well,
it's a challenge.
Mary, you're doing as much as anybody in trying to make it easier. And I think you're doing really well with it from what I'm hearing from everything. But so you must be feeling optimistic.
I mean, I am feeling optimistic in a couple of places, which is that we have seen an unprecedented expansion of whistleblower reward and empowerment programs across the globe. So it's not just in the United States. Canada has 2 programs similar to our SEC and IRS programs. There's programs in Africa now, in several countries in Africa. South Korea is a paragon of these programs. So I think we're at a time where there's unprecedented levels of thinking, flirtations with legislation that seeks to do more than just protect, but to empower whistleblowers. Australia, New Zealand are looking at legislation. They got scared at the last minute and didn't include the reward mechanism. But I think that there's just a willingness on the global front to learn from each other, and but on both sides of the pond, because like I said, I don't think the United States has all the answers to whistleblower laws, and we're very much looking to what the UK is considering with this Office of the Whistleblower as a central clearinghouse. So I think we have a lot of sharing that's going on, and I think that we're seeing more and more governments looking and seeing the evidence of the success, at least in the North American programs, that it's a tool that they want to use themselves.
Okay. So, Katherine, I think where we've got to is it's the perfect place for lawyers and journalists to work together, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. Some of my best friends are lawyers. I will say that.
Not many people say that. Apart
I know.
from other lawyers.
But I will say this, which is, you know, I agree absolutely with Martin that the path for a whistleblower has always been terribly challenging, and I think will largely remain so. I would say one thing that has changed the landscape somewhat journalistically is these global investigative collaborations that we've seen, which have had a very significant role. For example, the Panama Papers. You know, I'm very active in a group, a Global Investigative Journalism Network, and the consortium of journalists across the globe that are able to expose, you know, transnational crime and those sorts of things through whistleblower document dumps is a very kind of promising way forward, and I'm sure that we will see a lot more of it in the coming years.
Okay. Katherine, Martin, Mary, Henry, it's been an absolute privilege having this discussion with you. I've found it fascinating, and I hope everyone who's listening to it finds it the same. Can I just thank you very, very much for your time today, and I look forward to further discussions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Stuart.
Thank you, Stuart.